Ahi Maria, everyone, and welcome. And thank you for coming to our session. The aim of this talk is to provide an overview of a project that was a collaboration between a number of institutions, Auckland Libraries, who are here in the audience, Auckland War Memorial Museum, the Hocken Collections in Dunedin, as part of the University of Otago, and National Library of New Zealand, of course, and the wonderful Alexander Turnbull Library. We want to talk about some of the challenges of this project and some of the things that we'd implement if we did anything like this again in the future. Hey, Mel. Are you all aware of Papers Past? Is there anyone who doesn't know what Papers Past is? Well, just in case, it's a keyword searchable website providing digital access to heritage newspapers, magazines and journals, letters and diaries, and parliamentary papers. Thanks, Mel, I forget. Hosted by National Library, of course. The newspaper section contains digitised New Zealand, Māori and Pacific newspapers, ranging in date from 1839 to 1950, very recently to 1950, which is a great slight extension. So, Auckland in the 1840s. Why are these titles important to digitise for the country? Well, by March in 1840, Governor Hobson had moved the colony's capital from Kororareka to the Bay of Islands to Auckland. And as you can see from this lovely image, there wasn't much there. There was very little infrastructure, very few settlers at that time. However, within a few months, and by July that year, the first newspaper was launched, the New Zealand Herald and Auckland Gazette. And I think that's a testament to the importance newspapers paid in communities at that point. And for me, you know, the whole thing of Papers Past really democratises access to these newspapers. It's a wonderful resource for researchers. Some of the earliest reporting on the establishment of Auckland is provided in these newspapers, and they provide insight into the sort of personalities and events, and a treasure trove for researchers and historians. So the newspapers themselves, as I said, the New Zealand Herald and the Auckland Gazette, which ran for barely a year, but I'll get back to that. The Auckland Chronicle and the New Zealand Colonist, which went from 1842 to 1845, and the Auckland Times, which went from 1842 to 1846. When I started working at the library in the museum, I had no idea that newspapers had been published so early in Auckland's history, and that these papers, you know, were the communication tool for both the administration and for the growing community and the varying opinions that they held. In fact, they were the social media of the day. There wasn't anything else. And if you start reading them, they're full of lots of useful information for the new settlers, but they were also full of debate about what was going on, and often they were in opposition to the colonial administration of the day. The administration's response to that was actually close them down, hence the first paper only lasted a year, because they had the only printing press in Auckland at the time, and so if they weren't happy, they just closed the papers off. One of my favourite characters who was publishing at that time, I might go back to my notes, was a guy called Henry Folwasser. He came in 1842, and he was very energetic and entrepreneurial, and he vowed in the first issue of his paper that he published the Auckland Times, that he was going to be very non-partisan, he wasn't going to take anyone's side, and within 9 issues he was closed down. So you can see that the minute you stepped out of line in relation to what the colonial administration's, what they wanted said, you know, that was that. However, he was very enterprising, and he found himself some mismatched type that he got from here and there. He acquired a laundry mangle, and also some paper of dubious quality, and kept going. It was very enterprising of him, and eventually he went to Sydney and purchased a printing press of his own so he could carry on. I think his character is sort of typical of the sort of energetic and often eccentric people that ended up in New Zealand at that time. He was pretty determined, and at one point called out one of the officers of the 58th Regiment that was in Auckland and to a duel because of his reputation had been impugned, and so they had pistols at dawn. Fortunately, no one was hurt, just a few coattails shot through. I mean, but it sort of gives you a sense of the people that were involved in the newspapers then. Right, back to the project. No one held a complete run of these titles, and I'll talk a little bit more about how I pulled the information together in the next slide. And collaboration across this number of institutions was not going to be easy. It was going to be quite complex. However, I had done something similar when I was working as the collection manager for Rodney Libraries in the mid-2000s, where we had no local history, and so I worked with Bruce Ralston, who was at the Museum Library at the time, and Turnbull Library and National Library to do a similar sort of approach of collaboration to get things onto papers past. The other thing was, because the papers for this project were all over the country and often were in quite a fragile state, they needed to be captured in situ, which means, of course, that the normal project approach for papers past is to microfilm first and then digitise, so we couldn't do that. A number of us had to do some conservation work to stabilise the papers to enable the digitisation, but we each digitised our own sequence of papers, which then were sent off to Mel at National Library. Communication was going to be needed. We all know how difficult it can be to maintain communication within our organisations, so it was a particular challenge, I think, for the project to maintain momentum and make sure that we kept everybody on track and informed at the same time. And of course the project needed to fit in with 5 different work plans, budget rounds and levels of resourcing and priority. So it did take a bit longer than we anticipated, but we got there, and the papers went live August this year. Before we could do anything really, we had to establish what was available, and just change that. And so I created this sort of, it was a bit of a behemoth of a spreadsheet, and started, I looked at Harvey's, which some of you may know, Ross Harvey's union list of newspapers across numerous institutions in New Zealand, which he put together in about 87, I think. So I started with that, and also with Te Puna, of course, because that's the most complete list. However, I did find Harvey's much more helpful, because he did talk about the holdings, whereas often on Te Puna there's no holding statements. And as we all know, serials and newspaper holding statements are often, well, they're notorious for not being accurate. So once I'd done that basic spreadsheet, then I shared it with the institutions, who then did a sense check, and also did a sense check around condition to see so we could work out who had the most complete issues and good quality issues. I think that's pretty much all. We were really lucky that we've pretty much got a complete run of those 3 papers. However, we don't have a complete run, so it'll be interesting to see if anything surfaces in the future that we'll be able to add at a later date. Because we didn't do the microfilming first, it might be easier actually to do that post initial project edition. Anyway, I was really impressed at how many we could find, given how fragile that format is, and from such an early date in our history. Okay, tēnā koutou katoa, and I'll hand over to Mel, who's going to talk about the more nitty-gritty of the project.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou katoa. Yes, I'm going to talk a bit more about the technical issues we came across. As Paula mentioned, her and the other institutions had done a huge amount of work before I got involved, sorting out the run available and who had what and who needed to capture what issues, which is actually a huge part of the digitisation process that's often in the background that people don't realise. It takes a large amount of time. So for me, I was really lucky that I came in when that had already been done. So the things that I need to get underway initially were an agreement between the 4 institutions, which is just to sort out things like credit lines and acknowledgements and those kind of things. So as Paula mentioned, communication within your own institution is sometimes difficult. Getting agreements between 2 institutions is sometimes difficult. Getting one between 4 of us, but we did in the end, and that wasn't too bad. And then we needed to come up with some specifications so that people could start capturing the images of the newspapers. So the basic process we were going to follow is the collection assessment, then digital photographs of all the pages were going to be taken and supplied to us. So the various institutions either had existing contracts with digitisation vendors themselves, or they had their in-house imaging staff. And so what we ended up with was 4 different vendors taking images of the newspapers. So then the process was, once we got the files, we would get them processed, and the image conversion and the OCR would happen. We'd get the essays written. We have, on the title page of Papers Past, there's always a brief historical overview of the newspaper, and luckily for me, Paula volunteered to write those this time. Once the digital files have been OCR'd, we get the data back and we check it and we load it, and then eventually they're released on Papers Past. And with this particular project, we also did a press release, which again involved multiple inputs, not just from our organisations, but also from the Department of Internal Affairs, because that's what the National Library is part of. So in order to get the digital images, we took the specifications that we normally send to our digitisation vendor and pulled out the specifications for the preservation masters. So that's what we were after, just the preservation master files. So we wanted colour images, we wanted them to be TIFF files, we wanted them to have a particular resolution. There are some specific tags that we require, and there's also a naming convention. Which the naming convention is the naming convention we have, and it's what our systems are set up to deal with. You could have a different naming convention, but we would then have to change our entire system. So we wanted people to follow this. And I'll just very quickly skim through these so you can see the directory is really just made up of the acronym for a newspaper. So NZHAG was what we called the New Zealand Herald and Graphic, which is one of my favourite acronyms we've come up with. And then the others are just the year of publication, month and day. And for the file names itself, because they're preservation masters, there's a default that we want people to use, page sequence number, and then because they're preservation master files, again, they're always TIFF files. So, and this is what we got back. So the whole process, I think, took from June to October. So I think Auckland Museum got theirs underway first, and then the rest kind of followed. And as we go through, you'll see, I hope, that there is a difference, a kind of visual difference that you're starting to see between the different batches. So one of the things for digitisation, what we're looking for is consistency. When I was trying to think about a way of explaining it, the best thing I could come up with was, if you think about microfilming a newspaper, by the time you've got a microfilm, the consistency to some extent has already been done because it's black and white and the size has been scaled appropriately. So that's what we were looking for in the digital files, an equivalent. I'm going to skim quickly over these because I am running out of time. So there are 2 things here. One is you can see the colour difference here, that they're quite a lot yellower than these pages. Also for preservation masters, if you can see the paper texture, that's a sign of a good capture. These ones look a bit as though they've been flattened out, so you're losing some detail. Again, this is just samples again, and with the histograms here. So you can see with these top two, you can see that the blue is much bigger and it's come out, it's away from the rest of the colours. And that's what's explaining the colour cast here. Ideally what we're looking for is a neutral capture. Again, just a quick to show you the difference between the sizes. These are all taken at 100% of each capture. So a difference there, although to be fair, this is a bit not the best example because they were from different articles, so the font's different anyways. This was just what we did here. These are the variations are just shown in megapixels, which is really just the height of the image in pixels and the width of the image in pixels times together. And this is just really a visual way of showing the difference between the 4 batches. Again, I mentioned we needed specific metadata. So these were some of the fields that we required, and that was what we were going to test them against. You can see from the results, most of them were fine, but there were these ones, so there were 90 files that the image compression, the correct image compression hadn't been applied. 56 of them didn't have the image date time, which is normally an automatic setting, so we're not quite sure what happened with that particular batch. And down the bottom you'll see that almost everyone failed to put in the image artist field that we required. So it's not a default field, I guess, so that you need to go in and add it, and that seemed to throw a lot of people up. Again, with the file naming, really skip over this. This is just the tests we used. You can see, unfortunately, the file naming in terms of the failures. That's the percentage that actually passed. So that's obviously a problem. And so I think, when you come across a system where obviously people are struggling with it, it's going to be the system, it's not them, I think. It's the same if it's a website that's not working, it's usually the website design. So we have started to redo the instructions using more of a Windows terminology and including diagrams and so on, so that people can see the path we want and how we want the files named. And since we've done that, the 3 results I've had back, the file naming has been working really well, so we seem to have solved that particular issue. In terms of why this is important, it's because what happened was that we found all these problems, and then to get them into a state where we could send them off to have the image conversion done, we needed to try and fix them. And all up, Greg estimated it took him about a month's worth of work to get them into a state where we could do that. The thing with the way that newspapers, the way our process goes, is we do 4 newspaper task orders a year. They're usually between 100,000 and 125,000 pages. If we miss the opening for one of them, then it actually pushes out the timeline another 2 or 3 months. And so with all these things, that's one of the reasons why our timeline extended as much as it did. One more interesting thing, you might see here, that page has got a white background. That one, which is the reverse, doesn't have a white background. And in the end, we decided that was going to look so strange on the website that we got them fixed so that you can see here we do at least have a matching white background. Okay, and then finally, 19 months later, we got them online. And so that was great. This is just, you probably won't be able to read it, but this is just a little review from the listener, which describes them as 3 feisty papers of the post-treaty years, and talks about how they've added a spice to papers past. So that was nice. And we did notice, so after they went up, there was a kind of immediate spike in articles that were being read, which has eased off a bit, but yeah, that's kind of what we'd expect, as everyone would go and look at them. Okay, so some of the things we learnt. We learnt that is a model for direct digitisation when no one has one set of the newspapers and when microfilming isn't an option. It definitely needs more tweaking, I think. I think Paula and I worked quite well together, but there were some times when the communication was either one or the other of us and we weren't quite clear about that. So, ideally we would need to work, I think, with the image suppliers more closely about our specifications and be able to work with them in a much more, it would be more of a long-term process, but work through it so that we got what we wanted up front. One of the other troubles that we had was that we didn't have time, because of the other things we were doing, to actually QA the images as they came in. And so by the time we were looking at them as one big group, the vendors had moved on, the newspapers had gone back into storage. We weren't in a position to be able to go back to people. So we did get samples early on, but we need to test them much more. So overall, I think I've heard a lot about collaboration today. I think this is a good example, but I think people need to realise too the time taken is kind of exponentially much more. These were just under 800 pages. In terms of the time taken, if you think of what Tracy normally pushes through, 100,000 pages compared to 800, it's not a win on that scale. But we got them up. They're all searchable, and everyone now has preservation copies, and they will eventually go in the NDHA as well, so they will all be preserved. Thank you.
Just quickly, I wanted to say thank you to Auckland Libraries, to the Hocken Libraries, Peter, Tim and Graham and Turnbull, for being so unwilling to collaborate and making it easy for us to keep this project on. Couldn't have done it without them.
No, thank you.
Did anyone want to ask a question?
But happy to answer anything.
Question. Do you know, is there anything else that's comparable to this in the collections that
We'll just wait.
We'll just get
you
you
could
pop it
repeat
through the
it?
microphone.
Are there any other collections like this that are yet to be digitized?
I mean, so early on.
Yeah, or that are scattered across the different institutions.
Yeah, check 1, 2. Okay, sorry.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yes, so the Auckland Examiner is one that Paula's looking at the moment, where they hold some and Turnbull holds some. But we're building up a list of newspapers for direct digitisation, where they are very scattered, and I'm trying to start looking for partners for those papers. But that's quite a long-term project, yeah. But definitely, there's, yeah.
There is another early Bay of Islands paper as well, from 1839 or 1840, The Observer, that hasn't been done. So that's a possibility, just because it's at that time period, which is very early on in the sort of colonial history period. So that's another one I think that we would probably have to do let's cobble together and see what we've got, because I don't think anyone would have a complete run of that either, given that it was being published off the Mission Press, I think, in Paihia. So there are still gems out there, for sure. And I bumped into Ross Harvey at a book launch a couple of weeks ago in Auckland, and he's working on updating his union list, so there might be a digital version sometime soon. It's more contemporary with what we know about the newspaper collections around the country now. Yeah.
Yep, and then join me in thanking